Okay, welcome back. It is September 15th. Weird that it's already September 15th. Anyway, we are going to continue with the theme that we started last time, which is problems in sentence correction that depend upon the precise intended meaning. I mean, all problems in sentence correction do depend to some degree on intended meaning. But if you saw if you saw the last time, the September 1st recording, we looked at a few sentences where the specific intended meaning actually lets you predict to a certain extent how the sentence is going to be written, and or to eliminate a few choices because they just don't say what the sentence is supposed to say. So the same thing's going to happen here. You should always be thinking about intended meaning anyway. That's the step one of every sentence correction problem, is to think about that. But it's going to be especially important in these problems. Here is the obligatory copyright notice again. These problems are all from the free GMAT prep. They are all copyright GMAC, unless otherwise noted. Let's do one. Here is problem. Remember where the multiple choices are. Please do not try to answer the question in the chat. Please answer the question here in the multiple choice area. All right, go for it. Okay, let's pick something here. If you don't have an answer yet, please pick one. All right. So remember what today's theme is. Today's theme is that, talking about using the precise intended meaning of the sentence. So when you do sentence correction, remember what the first thing that you should do is. You should look at the sentence itself, and you should establish what the sentence is supposed to say. And in general, as a guideline, I find this is actually a very good barometer of whether you are thinking about sentence correction in the right sort of way, too. You should actually spend more than half the time here on the original. And you should actually spend less than half the time on all of the answer choices together. Like not per answer choice, but actually combined. Less than half the time here. I mean, when people are kind of not really doing this the right way, a lot of the time they wind up spending 20% of the time here, maybe even 10%, and they wind up spending 80 or 90% of the time on the choices. If that's what you guys are doing, it means that you are not spending anywhere close to enough time on the original sentence and establishing exactly what it's supposed to say. Because remember that when you discover a split in the answer choices, you should never have to think retrospectively about how to resolve it. You should always know already. If there's a meaning issue that goes into that split, you should always know what the relevant meaning is. So keep that in mind. But let's talk about how this works. Before we talk about this, let me just pull out a couple of sentences from Parallelism unit here. Right, you'll see some sentences show up on the board here in a second. You see two pairs of sentences on the board. What we're going to do here is we're going to pick one sentence out of each pair that is legitimate. Like obviously the material of the sentences is not nearly as formal as the material of the GMAT problems, but just take a look at them, and then the way we're going to vote on this is using the multiple choice area again. Give me choice A if you think the first sentence from each pair is correct. Give me choice B if you think here, let me number the sentences. It's probably easier that way. 1, 2, 3, 4. Give me choice A if you think that number 1 and number 3 are correct. Give me choice B if you think that number 1 and number 4 are correct. Give me choice C if you think that number 2 and number 3 are correct. And give me a choice D if you think that number 2 and number 4 are correct. Okay, let's talk about it. So remember, the intended meaning is always the first thing. I mean, this is not, if you thought this was the quant section, then you might pick something like A. Let me know if you guys understand. Yeah, I mean, give me a smiley face if you understand what that comment means. Like this is the choice. This is what you would pick if you thought this was the quant section. I mean that's wrong. It's not 1 and 3. But give me a smiley face if that makes sense as a comment. Let's see if you understand what I mean. Like what I mean by this is, if you thought these were formulas and you thought that you could just fit words into a template the same way that you fit variables into a mathematical formula, then this is the way that this would work. Because sentence 1 and sentence 3 are structured in exactly the same way. So if this were the quant section, then if number 1 was right, number 3 would also be right. And if number 1 was wrong, number 3 would also be wrong. The problem is not the quant section, guys. So, no, not how it works. I mean, the first thing you have to do is figure out what the intended meaning is. So, I mean, if you're going to put all 3 of these in parallel, like X, Y, and Z, like if you're going to make a parallel structure like that, you have to want to make a parallel structure like that. You have to be like, you know, if you were going to make bullet points, you'd have to want to make these bullet points. Like 3 different things. If you think about it, this doesn't make sense as 3 different things. I mean, devouring lunch, crunching, and swallowing food are not 3 bullet points. So this makes no sense. They're not 3 different things. On the other hand, this sentence makes perfect sense, because devouring lunch, gulping down drinks, and then falling asleep are totally 3 different things. Like if you made this 3 bullet points, okay, I ate lunch, I gulped down some drinks, I fell asleep. I mean, this makes absolutely perfect sense. But these are actually 3 different things. So this is correct. This makes sense. This one, on the other hand, is incorrect because it's nonsense. I mean, nonsense is always incorrect. Smiley face, if that makes sense. Smiley face icon. I'm especially looking for smiley faces from people who picked someone's asking a question about, I don't know what incomplete phrase means, but there are no grammar issues in any of these sentences. I mean, these are all, if you were the green squiggly line in Microsoft Word, you would think that all of these sentences were fine, because there are no grammar issues with any of these. I mean, the issues are the intended meaning is not conveyed. So, but on the other hand, if you look at the structure of 2 and 4, I mean, these are the comma ing kind of modifiers. I mean, the way that kind of modifier works in general is you're describing previous action. I mean, there are actually, I think, a few study halls that are just about this whole comma ing. But one of the examples that I use basically every time for this is I drop bags onto the floor, comma, scaring the dogs. So if you know how that sentence works, then you understand how comma ing works. So comma ing describes the previous action. It's an extremely useful modifier because the point of this modifier is that it's not just describing a noun. I mean, if you want to, like if you think about the point of this sentence, the point of this sentence is that none of the nouns here scare the dogs. I mean, the floor definitely doesn't scare the dogs. Dogs like floors. And I didn't scare the dogs personally, but my action of dropping the bags did. So, comma ing describes this action. But if you bullet point wise, it's not 2 things anymore, right? So if you think about making bullet points or whatever for these sentences, I mean, I ate lunch, and then indent, crunched, and swallowed. That actually makes sense. Like where these are 2 sub-points of this one. It's not A, B, and C. It's not 3 different things. It's one thing, and there's 2 further descriptions of it. This actually makes sense. It's one thing plus 2 further descriptions. As opposed to number 4 is nonsense because, again, this doesn't make any sense either. I mean, falling asleep is certainly not part of devouring lunch. So this is nonsense. You can see the point here. The point is you have to establish the intended meaning first. I mean, these are not formulas, and if you are treating sentence 1 and sentence 3 as the same, then you are going to have a very hard time with sentence correction because the entire point of sentence correction is that sentences like number 1 and 3 are not the same. And that if you don't establish the intended meaning, then you can't do this. So there you go. Give me a smiley face icon if this makes sense in general. Okay, so if we go back to the problem, you gotta establish the intended meaning first. You gotta do it, guys. So if you think about this problem, let's talk about indenting stuff. Let's talk about making bullet points and things like that. I mean, regulating the use of bicycles is a very generic idea. This is a very overarching general category. So it's not regulated and mandated and required. And so, I mean, like these are not all bullet points. Like if you tried to put all of these in parallel, like if you tried to make the sentence like this, if you tried to think of it as regulated, mandated, required, and granted, I mean, then you would get nonsense. In the same way you would get nonsense if you thought falling asleep was part of eating lunch. It just doesn't make any sense. If you think about the relationship here, I mean, regulating bicycles is kind of its own thing. And then these other things are ways of regulating bicycles. Like this is a way of doing that. So is this. And so is this. I mean, if you think about this might not seem at first to be bicycles, but if you think about granting pedestrians right-of-way, if you think about who they actually have to restrict in order to do that, they have to restrict bicycles. Like granting pedestrians right-of-way means telling people on bikes to get out of the way of pedestrians. So there are three things that should be in parallel here. Exactly three, which are those three. So these three things. In the same way that crunching food and like swallowing are those should be parallel, but not eating lunch itself. So these three should be parallel. Give me the smiley face if that makes sense. Mandated, required, granted. Those are the things that should be parallel, and they should not be parallel to regulated use of bicycles. Because that's not a parallel idea. So, not sure what you are saying about wood. Perhaps you can include some more detail about that one. So if you look at those three, just look at those three words. You want mandated, required, and it granted. So it granted is not parallel in the first place. That's not how it works. So that violates parallel structure. If that doesn't make sense, there are a couple of these Thursday programs on parallelism where we go into that in lots of detail. So if you don't understand why the it screws up the parallelism, then check out those other sessions on parallelism itself. But also, you don't want regulated to be in parallel with those, so it's also bad for that reason. I mean, you don't want this in parallel. So, nope. Okay. Mandated, required, comma, granting, that's not parallel. Mandated, required, and it granted, nope. Mandating, requiring, and it granted, nope. Mandated, required, and granted. That's the only choice that even has those parallel to each other. So, and also, if you think about it, you could have predicted this when you looked at the original, because the point of the sentence is to say what the law did. So, like, the main verbs of this sentence should be those three verbs. Like, you could have actually predicted that as well, because that's the main point of the sentence. The purpose of the sentence is to say, the law did these three things. So you should actually have those three as the main verbs of the sentence. And then the blue thing should be a modifier. So, in other words, the question in the chat box, I mean, this is why when you do step one, you should try to think about how the sentence would be structured if you were, I mean, they're not going to give you answer choices that do something like this, but this would be worse, because it wouldn't convey the main point in the main sentence, right? Like, this is, the main point is not, oh, this ordinance just regulated the use of bikes, and here's some random modifiers about what it did. I mean, like, this is, the main point is the law did this, and did that. I mean, this would not be wrong, so they're not going to give you this as an answer choice. So there's a couple of points about this that are important. The first is, it wouldn't actually be incorrect enough to be a wrong answer. But it's bad writing. They're not going to give you bad writing in the right answers. So the more important point here is, do not make up your own answer choices to these problems. Don't do it. Really, really, really don't do it. Like, if you spend much time on our forum, you'll see me telling people over and over and over this. Because if you make up your own answer choices, what's going to happen is, like, in literally 99.9% of the cases, you're going to make up stuff that is worse than the actual correct answer or incorrect for reasons that are not tested on this exam. So, because this test only tests something like 1% of the things that could actually go wrong with an English sentence. Like, the vast majority of problems with written English are not tested at all on this exam. So if you're going around making up answer choices, then they're going to have problems that are outside the bounds of this test. Just make sure you don't do that. Okay. Let's move on to another problem. Let's do it. How about this one? Right here. How about this one? Remember where the multiple choice answers are found. Those are here. Go for it. Okay, let's talk about this. Remember what you should do? You should figure out what the intended meaning is first. I mean, basically they found this skeleton, right? And, like, the skeleton is really small. In fact, skeleton is so small. Like, what's the point? What's the intended meaning here? Tell me in the chat. The point of the sentence is what about the size of this skeleton? People are typing. Yeah, Cynthia says that it's different. Yeah, the point is that it's so small. Like, I mean, the size is so different from normal human skeletons that scientists actually are like, yo, this is a different species entirely. So, right? That's the point. The point is that this skeleton is so small that scientists say it's a different species. I mean, there's also, you have to know this whole construction of so small that something happens. But this is a pretty, they use the word idiom for these kinds of constructions where certain words are just paired with certain other words because they are. But this is pretty basic, and the kinds of idiomatic constructions that this exam tests are going to be basic like that, like so small that. If you are familiar with English on any sort of significant level, you're going to know that construction, right? But this is the point. The point of the sentence is that the smallness of this skeleton is so much of a thing that scientists are like, dude, it's a different species. Ha. And you can also notice this too. So you have to have a that in there somewhere. This is a pretty basic construction. So it's so small that some intelligence have made this argument. In fact, if you realize that before you even go to the choices, you know that you have to have this. And that's enough to knock out everything except the correct answer. It's so small. This is grammatically, this is a modifier, right? So small that there's no such thing as so small and so something. And there's also no they. There's also no such thing as so small so that. It's actually enough to pick the right answer right there. But the point is that you don't even need the answer choices to do that. If you just understand what the point of the sentence is, you already know this is going to happen. It's going to have to be, okay, this thing is so small that blah, 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 blah. That's just how it works. Neato. And of course you have to be familiar with this kind of construction, but I'm sure you are. If you are processing formal language on the level of this exam, you should definitely know. So small that, blah, 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 blah. Any questions on this? Now I can do another one. Let's do another one. Let's see. How about this problem? Compared with and compared to, there's actually no difference. There's no significant difference at all. Those are basically equivalent to each other. So, all right, try this problem. Don't forget to use the multiple choice option. Yeah. That's not it. Forget. Where's the multiple choice option? There they are. Let's pick a choice. Remember, when it comes to time management on this exam, time management is really just not staring at stuff. I mean, when it comes to the verbal section, when it comes to the quant section, time management is trying to, time management means you have to identify the, in the quant section, time management means you have to really tell when your steps that you're doing are actually going somewhere versus being kind of, this is what would give me partial credit in school. In the verbal section, time management is more like, am I just staring at the screen versus am I actually doing something? In fact, you could summarize verbal time management pretty well with just 2 lines. Verbal time management is basically just looking at things is bad, but looking for things is good. Meaning, if you're looking at the words and you're just like, la la la, I'm looking at words, that is bad time management. But if you are actually trying to do stuff with those words, like if you're looking, when you're up here, you should be looking for exact intended meaning. And then when you're looking at the answer choices, you'd either be looking for a decision point, like an actual systematic difference, or you should already have a decision point in mind and you should be trying to resolve it. But there should always be an objective. Like if someone stopped you and said, what are you doing with those words right now? You should have an answer to that. So let's talk about it. Okay. What's the point of the sentence? I mean, the ideas in the sentence are, you've got creating farmland, you've got giving consumers cheap houses and furniture, you have caused erosion and deforestation. I mean, what's the relationship? How would you guys summarize? Tell me in the chat box. How would you summarize the actual relationship among these 3 ideas? Yeah, long story made short, a couple of you guys are getting this in the chat box. I mean, you have 2 good things and you have bad things. So, right, you have good thing, bad thing. So, you have structured a sentence accordingly. I mean, it created farmland and it gave consumers good things, but it also caused some destruction to the environment. In terms of structures, like the things you have in these sentences, you have to know what these things do. I mean, what does not only but also do? Like what is the point of that? Does that create a contrast? Yeah, right. If you think about something, not only something, but also something else, that's not a contrast, right? And I mean, when you think about these things, don't try to memorize rules for them in rule form. What you should remember is just examples of these things. Like if you said something like, "My wife is not only brilliant, but also beautiful." I mean, that's a typical sentence that uses that kind of construction. Meaning these are two good things. I mean, the point of not only X, but also Y is you have two things that reinforce each other. That's the point. As opposed to the word but, which is, I mean, the word but normally does what the word but does. I mean, these things, you can have the also there as an extra bit of emphasis, but if the not only isn't there, then this is what the word but is normally used to do. It's just to create a contrast, right? So, X, but also Y. I mean, this is your normal use of but to create contrast. So sure. Okay. I mean, but we need a contrast here. We need two things that are good and one thing that is not good. So A and B make no sense because it's not a bunch of positives and it's not a bunch of negatives. And also, you want parallel things. I mean, these whole ideas are on the same level of priority. Like none of these is a sub point, and none of these is on some sort of lesser level than others. So these should be parallel to each other. I mean, it should be if it's creating, giving, causing, it should be, but they shouldn't be modifiers, right? Like you can predict how the sentence is going to be structured before you go to the choices. Again, that's the main point of this whole lesson, is before going to the choices, you should predict as best you can how the sentence will be structured. I mean, it's reasonable to actually predict what the main structure of this is going to be. It's going to be the clearing of forests, created farmland. These should be the main verbs of the sentence. They shouldn't be modifiers because they are the point of the sentence. It created farmland and gave consumers stuff, but also, there might be the also, there might not be the also, but caused bad things in the environment. You should actually be able to predict this before you even set eyes on the answer choices. Created farmland, gave consumers stuff, but caused bad things in the environment. So if you look at the remaining choices, I mean, notice clearing is not, clearing is a noun here. If there was a word like clearage or clearation, then it would be that instead. But this is a noun for a process. So these don't make sense as modifiers. You don't want those to be INGs. I mean, the clearing of forests created stuff and gave consumers stuff, but also caused absolutely D makes sense. And then actually, this is a not only, so E is nonsense right out of the gate. So we can also ignore E, because E is nonsense. Nonsense that makes no sense. How about that? And again, the point that we made before about relative time spent. I mean, when you look at the original sentence, you should already have figured out all of this. This should be in your head, all of this stuff in the blue box. This should all be in your head before you even look at the answer choices. Yes, it should. Cool. Okay. Let's look at another problem. About this one right here. There you go. Don't forget where the multiple choice answers are found. Those are found here. Okay, so you guys should pick something for this problem pretty soon. And with sentence correction, remember the approximate size of the problem in terms of literally how many words are on the screen should give you some idea what is a reasonable amount of time to take. I mean, if you are still staring at this after this long, then there's kind of an issue there. But let's talk about this. What does research indicate? Does research indicate people? Yeah, it indicates that something happened, right? Now, if you think about this, in terms of the precise use of words here, you might have to glimpse the answer choices to think about this. But if you look at the way A and B are constructed versus the way that the rest of these answer choices are constructed, I mean, you have some choices that say that research literally indicates people versus other choices that actually say the research indicates that few people have done something. I mean, here's a couple of other sentences that illustrate the same sort of difference. Like if you say, like, these data show that that certain areas have experienced sharp increases in housing prices. Versus this map shows certain areas that have experienced sharp increases in housing prices. I mean, like, think about the difference between these things. Like, these data show that certain areas have experienced stuff. That blah, 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 blah is this fact, right? They show that a certain fact is true. In general, when you have that blah, 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 blah happens, as opposed to this map shows certain areas, this means that the map literally shows the areas. And you wouldn't write something like this unless the map actually shows the areas themselves. Like you can literally look at the areas on the map. You can actually look at them. And again, if this seems like nitpicking to you, it's not nitpicking. And if it seems like it is, then you are underestimating the usefulness of multiple choice answers. Because like when you look at this versus these, this is a big and fairly obvious difference. Like if you were just looking at one of these sentences by itself, you might be like, oh, that's annoying. I don't know if I would notice that. But if you're looking at these choices versus those choices, you can very readily notice this difference, right? I mean, you are not indicating people. So these two choices don't make any sense because that's not the point. You're not actually indicating people. I mean, A and B would actually imply that you are pointing out the people themselves. So that's not a thing. You can't do that. That's how it works. Okay, now beyond that, what's the point of the sentence? So the point of the sentence is the data show that few people are driving any less than before. And also the data show that few people are making fuel efficiency a priority. I wonder how old this sentence is because actually, interestingly enough, a lot of people are making fuel efficiency a priority. Like one thing that is very noticeable if you drive around California, at least, is how much smaller cars have gotten in the last 10 years or so. But this sentence must be from like 10 or 15 years ago. But in any case, this is what the sentence is saying. Notice how you don't write this stuff because few is already a negative. So if you are like few and little and words like that, they work the same way as other negatives, like no. In other words, what you don't write is you don't write something like this. You don't write few people are not making fuel efficiency a priority. If your native language is something like French or Spanish or Italian or Catalan or one of those European languages, you're going to have to pay attention to this. Because the way that negative constructions are made in those languages is actually like this. Like in those languages, you actually write double negatives as a standard. Like in French and Spanish and those languages, you literally write things like no one is not doing this. Or few people are not doing that. But that's not how English works. So if your native language is, if you're from Western Europe, you need to pay a special amount of attention to this. Just FYI. If not, you can ignore that comment. But if not, you need to pay attention to this. Okay. So, and these things should be in parallel too. I mean, there are two observations that are on basically the same level. So, few people have reduced the amount of driving and are not making, I mean, this is not how you want to structure this. I mean, in fact, if you say few people are not making something, that actually means that most people are doing it. And few people are not doing this in English means that most people are doing this, which is not the point of the sentence. This is exactly the opposite of what you want to say. So, nope, that doesn't make any sense. As opposed to E, which actually says what we want to say. I mean, few people have done this, and few people have done that. Also, the way that negatives work, you might just, if English is not your native language, you might just want to memorize how this works. There's two, if you have more than one thing in your negation, pay attention to how you would write these things. Like, I don't have money and I don't have a job. You could also write, I don't have money or a job. This is how you write negations of more than one thing in English. So if you're going to write the entire negations, you would connect them with and. But if you're going to write them, if you're going to write just one negative, then you actually connect them with or. I mean, you actually don't have to have this memorized for this problem because you can cross out D for saying exactly the opposite of what you want to say. But you should know that this is how you would do this. Like you don't write, I don't have X and Y. That's not a construction with a single meaning. The question in the chat box, that whole previous discussion, I mean, if you have indicates people, whether there is an adjective in front of it or not, you are still literally saying indicates people. Like if you had this map shows few areas, this would still mean that a map is literally showing areas physically, just not very many of them. That's what it would mean. So, but this would still be physically showing areas. Just not very many of them. That's meant to address this question. Wow, that was really big. Back. Okay. And then C, no one actually picked C, but C is not parallel, right? You want these two things to actually be in parallel, reduced, made. And C does not put those in parallel. I mean, you have this weird ing thing going on here versus that's a verb. So that's not a thing. All right. Yeah, Manoj in the chat box is using programming symbols for negation, but that's basically the idea of how you would write that if you this sort of thing. I mean, again, however you want to memorize that. Like if you it wouldn't make any sense if you wrote the word and here, because it would be unclear what that meant. It wouldn't be clear whether you meant this or whether you just meant, like, I don't have both of these. So, but just know that this is how you write negations of more than one thing. Okay, let's do one more of these. Let's do it. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, one more problem. Boom. Don't forget where multiple choice answers are found. Those are found here. Okay, let's pick something pretty soon. Remember, it's mostly the middle of the alphabet, the M and N names that are not picking answers yet. But how this exam works, you can't not pick stuff. So please pick stuff. Okay. So what's the intended meaning of the sentence? I mean, remember, you should always be able to establish the main relationships in the sentence before you look at the choices. So what should we be able to figure out here before looking at the choices? Well, we got a couple of things, we got a couple of ideas in the sentence. You got these two relationships. You have, let's color these. Your land area is about the same as England's area. So you have 4 million people. I mean, England has a lot more than 4 million people. In fact, Great Britain is not just England, but I mean, all of Great Britain has a lot more than 4 million people. You probably know that. At least if you don't know that, you should. So, I mean, Greater London itself has several times as many people. So this is a contrast. Like, same area, but a much smaller population. So these two ideas should be parallel, but in contrast. Parallel but contrasting ideas. And then what is the point of, like, how does this yellow thing relate to the rest of the stuff? You should know this. You should pick up on this before you look at the choices. Yeah, this is a modifier of the population. So it should absolutely not be parallel to stuff. Exactly, melody. This should be a modifier of the 4 million people, or the, yeah, this should modify population or 4 million people. It definitely shouldn't be parallel to any of those things. So if you think about and, I mean, it's not and. That makes no sense. Because it's not. These are not separate ideas. I mean, again, just to make sure that you guys are thinking carefully about this when you notice these kinds of differences. I mean, you might not notice these differences if you were just randomly looking at random sentences. But when you have 2 choices that say and 3 choices that don't, that means that these 2 are supposed to be separate ideas. and these three are not. I mean, just remember that the point of and is specifically that you are not modifying something. It means that you are saying these are separate things. So, okay. And then where is not the right kind of modifier? I mean, this is not a place. So that choice has its heart in the right place. Like, that is a modifier, but it's just not a modifier that makes sense. So we don't want that either. So that leaves us with C and E. If you think about these things, I mean, C, nobody even picked C because you can probably look at C and realize how awful it is. But there's no parallelism between these, apart from how weird this is to start with. I mean, with a population of, I mean, what is this trying to be parallel to? I'm not even sure. But those are not parallel, so you can get rid of it on those grounds. Because remember, you have a land area. That's part of that construction. It has to be a land area about as big as some other area, but a population, how those are actually parallel to each other. Look at that. Those are contrasting ideas. Those are properly parallel to each other. We want that. Parallel but contrasting ideas. There's our winner. And then you do have this modifier as well. The modifier is perfect. You have many of whom, which correctly describes the people in Laos. It's also perfectly done. I mean, you don't even need to look at that once you've eliminated the other choices, but that's just further confirmation that you are right. But notice, these things you should figure out before you even look at the choices. You should firmly understand that I need to have parallelism and contrast between these things. A land area is not underlined, too, so you could realize that it has to be a land area, blah, 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 but other noun. You can also make that realization up front. And then, moreover, that this has to be a modifier. So, I mean, that's the most important lesson you should take from this in general, is that you should be predicting all of this stuff before you even touch the answer choices. And again, as I pointed out, you should be spending more time looking at the original sentence than you do looking at all the answer choices combined. And people who are doing this wrong, people who are rushing through the original stimulus, I mean, a lot of those people will spend 90% of the time looking at the answer choices. If you are spending the vast, huge majority of time looking at the choices, then you are kind of doing life wrong here. So just keep that in mind. Okay, that's it. That's what we've got for today. We're actually going to finish about 1.5 minutes early. So what about that? It doesn't make any difference whether the original is correct, because you can still tell clearly that this is supposed to be the point. And I mean, these observations have nothing to do with the original being correct or not. I mean, this is also super important to understand. I mean, this does not depend in any way on having a correct original. I mean, these things should be, these relationships should be just as obvious either way. Like in other words, regardless of whether the original is correct or not. That should make no difference at all. I mean, the original is using this where modifier as though population was a place, but that's clearly incorrect. I mean, that makes no sense. It doesn't matter what the original does. I mean, these relationships should be clear. So, Sana, if you were here for the first 10 minutes where we talked about the rules, these study halls are not for random individual questions. If you want to submit, if you have an individual question about an individual problem, that belongs on the forum, not here. So the forum is here. That's the address of the forum. So that's where you should submit that. Okay. Gonna kill it. Thanks, guys. And next session, I think, is in 2 weeks. But go ahead and check the website. And thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, good luck. And we will do this again next time.